Hey, Lance Egan here with Fly Fishing Skill Builder number 3. Today's skill builder is all about streamer fishing, so we're really excited for it. First, we're going to talk about choosing the best streamer line for your needs. Second, I'm going to cover various streamer retrieves and keep an eye out for my favorite retrieve. And finally, we're going to show you how to strip set so you don't miss too many of those fish.
That's a big brown, bro.
All right, let's take a look at these lines. These are river specific. We have things from floating lines all the way through pretty dense long head sinking tips. I'm not including any full sinking lines in here, and although you can use full sinking lines for streamers, we're eliminating those from this stack of lines. So as you can see, I have a ton of fly lines in front of me. Do you need all of these? No, you don't. I have these kind of broken down into smaller groups. So we have floating lines here, we have shorter sink tip lines, more medium length sink tips, and longer sink tips. Now, when would you use some of these? Okay, floating lines. Number one, when you're doing a floating line with a streamer, think more aggressive taper. You're throwing a relatively large fly, usually fairly wind resistant. You don't want your super delicate trout taper that's designed to turn over a long, light leader for streamer fishing. Can you get by with it? Sure, in a pinch. But if you're selecting a line specifically for streamers, you want something like the Scientific Angler's Titan, or maybe a Rio Grande, a Scientific Angler's MPX, Airflow Power Taper, the Orvis Bank Shot, something like that, something that's got a pretty powerful delivery. Floating lines we mostly use in shallower situations with weighted flies, small rivers. Not a really common streamer line, but is very useful in some situations. So then moving down into more short sink tips, I've got some stuff as short as 5-foot sink tips here and into kind of the 10-foot range. Now we're talking about smaller rivers or situations where we don't need a lot of depth. As we go up in length, think about this. The more of the sinking portion of the line, the longer the tip of the line is that sinks, the more horizontal it'll keep your fly pulling. So the shorter the tip is, the more the fly gets pulled up because it's getting pulled towards that floating running line. So these little mini tips, again, shallow water or situations where you don't really want to get super deep, small rivers, maybe Alaska, salmon fishing, trout fishing on smaller rivers. As we get into more of the middle, 10-footers, 12-footers, now we're talking a little more general purpose, larger rivers, something you could still use if you're floating, where I would consider this more floating in a short sink tip, more of a wade fisherman's line. Now we're getting into, you can still wade fish with these, but we're getting into boat capable lines, fishing from a drift boat, fishing from a raft, etc. So again, 10-footers, 12-footers, maybe even up to 15-footers in kind of that mid-price, sorry, not price point, but mid-length line. Those lines, again, are going to pull a bit more horizontal. They also, all of these sink tips come in different sink rates. So from intermediate sink tips all the way through like type 7, type 8 sink tips. Obviously, the faster the sink type, a type 3 sinks faster than an intermediate, and a type 6 sinks faster than a type 3. So you have to kind of decide, do I want my flies down fast? Do I not want them fast? Do I want them deep? Do I want to keep them shallower? Most of the time for me personally, when I'm fishing from a drifting boat, I tend towards faster sinking lines. A 3 is usually on the slower side of things, and a 5, a 6, or a 7 sink tip for me is more useful because the diameter of the line doesn't sink quite as fast as you would think in most cases, so I usually err on the side of having a line that sinks a little too quick, and then I can use lighter flies as necessary. But so think about these as your kind of most versatile, somewhere in the middle of the road, 10, 12, 15-foot sink tips. If you're only a drift boat angler, then you probably are looking at something that's more along the lines of a 15 to 20, 25, or even 30-foot sink tip. These are going to pull very horizontal. They've got slightly longer heads for longer casts, very powerful delivery lines. We have sink tips for almost every angler. They come across the board in price points from kind of the mid-price points. You won't see a lot of sink tips in the really basic lowest price points, but let's call it value price points all the way through premium fly lines. There are lots of options for you. One of the things I want to focus on in this video too is we're talking about sinking tips on purpose. You don't really want a full sinking line in a river situation. You can use a full sinking line if you're only fishing from a boat. It can work well because you're stripping into the boat. But if you're a wading angler at all, having the running line sink as well as the tip sink when you're stripping in and you're wade fishing that running line sinks at your feet as well, and you can't recast it. It tangles around the rocks, tangles around the aquatic vegetation, tangles around your wading boots, and so on, and you can't create enough line speed with just a tiny bit of depth to cast and pull that line through the water column. It'll just make your cast turn over prematurely. So if you're using a full sink line, you have to either be in a boat or you've got to be in a situation where you're on the bank or stripping into a stripping basket or something like that. So I find the sinking tips with a floating running line are most versatile and most useful for me. The other thing I really like about these sinking tips is that you can manage and manipulate the back end of the line. You throw a cast out, and let's say you don't want to just cast, you don't want to strip it immediately. You make the cast and you want to let the fly get to depth. Well, you can mend and reposition and stack mend that running line that floats to your heart's delight to allow time for that line to get down. On the flip side, you could also manage the back end of a sinking tip that's floating, of course, the floating running line, to change the retrieve rate. You can slow it down, you can speed it up by throwing mends. So we really favor these sinking tip lines for most of our streamer applications. One other question we get a lot, can I use these in still water? Yes, you can use them in still water. However, these are much better suited for river fishing. In most still water situations, I favor a full sinking line. You're in a boat, you're in a flow tube, you're in a pontoon. You want that line, the whole thing, to be pulling horizontal. You don't need to manipulate the back end. The one exception there would be a midge tip, which is just basically a very short intermediate tip fly line specifically made for still water. Otherwise, these are more river specific, and if you wanted to get lines that are specific to lakes, I would look at full sinking lines. Hopefully that gave you some insight on sink tips and gave you some ideas about how to tackle your favorite streamer setup. All right, now that we're out on the water, let's talk a bit about streamer retrieves and some of the things we need to focus on as we fish streamers. So number one, streamer fishing, you're always either swinging or retrieving, and most of the time retrieving flies. So before we can even retrieve, we need to focus on what I like to call the control system, which is taking the line after you make a cast. We send the line out there, and we got to take the line from our non-rod hand, put it into our rod hand, so that we can then take up slack and strip the flies in. So to do that, again, first you make the cast, then you take the line from your non-rod hand, run it through. I like to run it through 2 fingers. You can run it through 1. You can run it through all of them if you like, or 3, doesn't matter. I like it to come out right in the center of my hand. That way I come back to the same place to retrieve the fly rather than reaching up here and trying to strip awkwardly at that guide. We run it right through our fingers. So the control system is something that's some muscle memory that if you're not used to already, you'll have to put together. As soon as you make a cast, it should just kind of become second nature to you to put the line through your rod hand and start taking up slack and stripping line in. You likely already do that if you fish dries or nymphs or any other technique. If you haven't tried any of these techniques for fly fishing before, then that's going to be the first thing you need to learn. So now that we have the control system in place, let's talk briefly about a few retrieves. Number one, you got to consider when you're fishing streamers, how fast do the fish want the flies moving? Is the water cold? Is it rather, relatively warm? Warm being relative for trout. Are the fish willing to chase? Are there bait fish that they might be chasing after, or are they chasing a little leech or something, crayfish, something that might be moving slower than the pace of a smaller minnow? So there's lots of things to consider, and some of those things don't really even matter other than just based on water temperature. They like stuff moving fast or slow. Generally speaking, the colder the water, the slower the flies need to go, and the warmer the water, the faster you can move the flies. That said, there are several retrieves. Some of my favorites are just your simple strip and pause. So stripping in, pausing between strips. Another favorite is short, quick strips. So after you make the cast, now we're going to drop the rod tip, do short, quick strips, pausing once in a while. Another is long strips, long, slow. So if we do the cast again, now control system, long strip, pause, long strip, pause, long strip, pause, sometimes moving the fly greater distances, especially if you're swimming a larger articulated minnow. It does more darting and those sorts of things. There are lots of other retrieves. You can retrieve with the rod tip where you're actually twitching the rod. That's not one of my favorites, but it is one that is used. Jerking with the rod tip, taking up slack. That's another one that can be used. And the last one that I use, and I use actually quite frequently as a wading angler, it's not common, it's pretty hard to do from a boat unless you're from an anchored position, is what I like to call the seesaw. We talk a lot more about this in our Modern Nymphing Masterclass. If you go to modernnymphingmasterclass.com, there's lots more about all of these techniques we're showing you with these skill builders. But the seesaw, you're basically using water tension. You send the cast out and you can mend it to slow it down or speed it up as the case may be. And then instead of retrieving line, we're actually stripping and giving, stripping and giving, stripping and giving, and I'm not running the line through my non-rod hand. Sorry, through my rod hand. There's a fish on the seesaw. You can see why I like the seesaw. The seesaw ends up keeping the fish, the fly right in front of the fish longer. Instead of stripping it away from them, it kind of glides in front of them and then dead drifts back into their face. Strip, pause, strip, pause. And I'm not moving it as much, so the fish have a tendency to not be able to resist the fly as it kind of stays in their strike zone longer. So this one kind of interrupted my seesaw. We're gonna have to do that one more time. Thank you anyway, Mr. Brownie. Get him back in the water. The seesaw again, we're not retrieving line. You eventually have to retrieve the line, but you're not retrieving it early on. We're extending the cast out. Then again, if I want to slow the speed of the retrieve down, I mend upstream. If I want to speed it up, I mend downstream. And instead of taking up slack, I simply pull and give, 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 until it gets to where you're either feeling the bottom or it starts getting almost straight downstream of you, and then we put the control system into place and we strip it back in to a reasonable length of line to allow us to recast again. So we'll send it out. If we were going to do short quick strips, it'd be like this, long slow like this, and if we're seesawing, we're giving, stripping, giving, stripping, giving, stripping. All right, the final tip in this streamer skill builder is learning to strip set. So the strip set, instead of when you feel a strike, instead of setting by moving the rod, you're pulling with the line. Now, I know most of you that have already fished streamers know that this exists. You know that you should be doing it, but we all have a tendency, ask any saltwater guide, all of us trout anglers have a tendency to want to pull with the rod when we feel something on the other end. You got to resist that temptation. When you're stripping streamers, number one, when you're ready to strip set, you want to keep your rod low. If your rod is high, you've got a big belly in the line that's extra slack. We don't want that. So we want to get rid of any of that slack. We're going to drop our rod tip down. If it's above the water at all, it's just barely above the water, and you can even stick the rod tip right under the water like this if you'd like. But then when a fish eats, we're going to pull with the non-rod hand, and if we miss them, it's okay. We're still in position to keep stripping and giving the fish another chance, another shot at our fly. Send these out here and we'll keep doing some fishing here. It doesn't matter whether you're doing the seesaw, whether you're stripping long and slow, any of these, if you get a grab, you're pulling the flies across and all of a sudden the fish grabs hold, you're going to pull with the non-rod hand. If you're stripping, strip, nothing there, keep it going. Strip set, nothing there. It's okay. Anything you feel, you're pulling with the non-rod hand. You got to resist the temptation to pull up with the rod. The rod has a lot of give to it. The reason it doesn't work as well, the rod's bending. It's designed to absorb shock. We don't want that. We want to penetrate that hook, so we want a straight line connection. We want to pull nice and hard. We've roped up with our tippet with streamers. We're going 3x on the light end of things, 2x, 1x, 0x, or heavier. We have plenty of strength. Pull a nice straight rod, get tight to that fish, and then lift the rod and fight the fish from there. That's streamer fishing in a nutshell. Again, there's lots more you can find on the YouTubes, or if you go to modernnymphingmasterclass.com, we have more in-depth pieces on streamer fishing.